Picture a cold January night in 1568. The air thick with the scent of wax and steel. The corridors of a Spanish palace silent except for the heavy clank of armor. A king, not in ceremonial robes but dressed for war, strides toward his son's bedchamber with a squadron of armed guards. This isn't a father coming to offer comfort or wisdom. This is King Philip II, ruler of the most powerful empire on earth, leading an invasion against his own blood. The door bursts open, and there, jolted from sleep, is Prince Don Carlos, heir to the Spanish throne. In that heart-stopping moment, his eyes meet his father's, hidden behind a steel visor, and he understands. This isn't a lecture or a punishment. It's an arrest. The man who gave him life has come to take his freedom, a betrayal that will echo through the courts of Europe. How does a father become the jailer of his only son, the boy destined to inherit his crown? To unravel this tragedy, we must step back to its origins, to a birth celebrated as a miracle but shadowed by a curse. Welcome to Grim Chronicles, where we dive into the darkest corners of history. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button. It's the best way to join us on these haunting journeys. Now, let's walk into the shadows of 16th century Spain and meet the boy prince who rotted alive. The year is 1545, and the Spanish royal palace hums with anticipation. Courtiers whisper excitedly about the imminent birth of an heir to the Habsburg dynasty, rulers of an empire stretching from the Americas to the Philippines. Every noble in the court is ready to celebrate, their voices filled with hope for the future of Spain. But behind closed doors, the royal physicians aren't sharing in the joy. Their faces are pale, their glances heavy with a truth the nobles don't yet grasp. This child, this long-awaited prince, is the product of a bloodline so obsessively pure it's become poison. Let me explain what pure meant to the Habsburgs. Most of us have 16 great-great-grandparents. Don Carlos? He had six. 10 of his ancestors were erased through generations of uncles marrying nieces, first cousins wedding first cousins, all to keep the royal blood untainted by outsiders. Their family tree wasn't growing. It was strangling itself, coiling inward until it choked out any hope of vitality. On July 8, 1545, Don Carlos entered the world. Court scribes recorded the event with golden ink and flourishing quills, their words dripping with grandeur. But they couldn't capture the invisible damage woven into the boy's very cells. The midwives saw it immediately. His head was oddly shaped, his cries weaker than a newborn's should be. Still, he was alive and he was male, and that was enough for the court to erupt in celebration. His mother, Maria Manuela of Portugal, held him just once. She was barely 17, her body torn apart by a brutal delivery that left her burning with fever. Within hours, her skin felt like parchment, her prayers in Portuguese barely audible as her ladies-in-waiting pressed cold cloths to her forehead. For days, that's all she had. For days to be a mother before infection claimed her life. The same bells that rang for Carlos's birth now tolled for her funeral. The infant prince, swaddled in silk, had no idea he'd cost his mother her life before he could even focus his eyes to see her face. And here's where the darkness deepens. Maria wasn't just his mother. She was his first cousin. Their fathers were brothers, their mothers sisters. This wasn't a marriage. It was a genetic echo chamber, and the consequences were already flowing through Carlos's veins. King Philip, only 20 himself, stood at his wife's funeral, cradling his newborn son. To the court, he was a grieving widower with his heir in his arms. But Philip saw something more, a glimpse of the price paid for the Habsburg obsession with purity. The wet nurses noticed troubling signs almost immediately. The baby's feeding was erratic, his sleep chaotic. He'd scream for hours without cause, then fall into eerie silences that terrified the servants. One nurse swore she saw him stop breathing for nearly a minute before gasping back to life, like a drowning man breaking the surface. The court physicians tried to reassure Philip. Infant troubles were common, they insisted. This boy carried the blood of emperors, of conquistadors who'd claimed half the world for Spain. Surely he'd grow strong. But they were wrong. That blood was the problem. Each generation of intermarriage had added another link to an invisible chain, and Carlos was born wearing all of them. As he grew, the signs became undeniable. By the time he was a toddler, his head was visibly asymmetrical, bulging on one side like a melon left too long in the sun. His left leg grew slower than his right, forcing him to walk with a lurching gait that echoed off the palace's marble floors. The Habsburg jaw, that protruding deformity, was just the visible tip of a deeper curse. The court pretended not to notice, but whispers followed Carlos everywhere. His body was a betrayal of the divine right of kings, a doctrine that held a monarch's form as a reflection of God's favor. A strong, symmetrical heir proved heaven's blessing. So what did Carlos's twisted frame say about the Habsburgs? What did it say about Spain? The royal armorer learned this the hard way when Carlos was 13. He sweated over a breastplate forged from the finest Milanese steel, but no amount of hammering could make it fit. The prince's torso curved inward where it should have expanded, his right shoulder sitting 2 inches higher than the left. Every breath Carlos took was a battle, his malformed ribcage fighting against his lungs. The court's portraits of him required increasingly clever angles to hide his deformities, but there was no hiding the truth from those who saw him up close. The physicians offered elaborate excuses. His humors were unbalanced, his stars misaligned at birth. Anything but the truth. Generations of inbreeding had produced a broken prince. They prescribed treatments that sound like torture today. Bleeding to balance his blood, mercury baths to straighten his spine, iron boots to force his shorter leg to grow. Each night, when those boots came off, Carlos's screams echoed through the palace, not just from pain but from rage at his own body's betrayal. He was supposed to be perfect. He was supposed to be king. His tutors reported even more troubling signs. Carlos's attention wandered constantly, fixating on strange details. The cracks in a ceiling, the sound of his own breathing while ignoring lessons on statecraft. His speech was erratic, sometimes eloquent, sometimes barely coherent, his tongue tripping over itself. And then there were the headaches, so crushing they'd send him to his chambers for days. Servants heard him pounding his malformed skull against the stone walls, trying to drive out the pain with more pain. When he emerged, his eyes were bloodshot, unfocused, as if he were seeing into some terrible other world. By the time he was 14, marriage proposals began arriving from across Europe. Royal families sent portraits of their daughters, eager to ally with Spain's vast empire. But Philip hesitated, deflecting with excuses. How could he describe his son to potential brides? How could he admit that the heir to the throne couldn't stand straight, couldn't breathe properly, couldn't even wear armor like a true prince? Foreign ambassadors who met Carlos sent coded messages back to their courts. The prince shows signs of weakness, they wrote delicately. His constitution appears delicate. They didn't dare write the truth, that the heir to Spain looked like a porcelain doll shattered and glued back together by a blind craftsman. The physical deformities were only part of the story, though. Something darker was stirring inside Carlos, a cruelty that would soon reveal itself in ways that chilled even the most hardened courtiers. Imagine a royal shoemaker, trembling as he presents a pair of boots to the prince. He'd labored for weeks to craft them, specially designed to accommodate Carlos's shorter leg. But when the prince tried them on, the left boot pinched just slightly. It was enough to unleash a rage that turned the elegant chamber into a theater of horror. "Eat them," Carlos commanded, his voice eerily calm. The shoemaker laughed nervously, thinking it a jest. But those bloodshot, unfocused eyes held no humor. "Cut them into pieces and eat them. Now." The court watched in stunned silence as the man, tears streaming down his face, took his own knife to the leather he'd perfected. The sound of cutting filled the room, followed by the worst sound of all. Chewing. The forced crunch of a man eating his own livelihood while a 17-year-old prince watched with satisfaction. This wasn't a one-off. It was a pattern. The palace kitchens whispered tales that made soldiers blanch. Carlos had developed a fascination with suffering. He'd order live rabbits brought to his chambers, then roast them alive over his fireplace, timing how long their screams lasted. Servants cleaning his rooms would find the charred remains arranged in grotesque patterns, like some twisted art. One young page made the mistake of laughing at Carlos's limp. That night, he woke to find the prince standing over his bed, a glowing poker from the fireplace in his hand. Only Carlos's own physical weakness saved the boy. He swung the poker but lost his balance, giving the page time to flee. The violence grew harder to contain. During a meeting with Portuguese dignitaries, Carlos grabbed a knife from the dinner table and held it to an ambassador's throat, demanding he admit Portugal was inferior to Spain. Philip had to intervene, coaxing his son to lower the weapon like one might calm a rabid dog. What terrified the court wasn't just the violence, it was the cunning behind it. Carlos knew who he could torment without consequence. Servants, craftsmen, those without power. In front of high-ranking nobles, he could play the part of a troubled but manageable prince. The moment they left, the mask dropped. The physicians had their theories. His deformed skull pressed on his brain. His humors were out of balance, but even they whispered privately about something darker. Was this madness born of his body? Or was it a fundamental evil that would have existed even in a perfect form? Philip tried everything. Priests prayed over Carlos, Europe's finest minds were consulted, and elaborate routines were set up to manage his impulses. Nothing worked. If anything, the attempts to control him made him more creative in his cruelty. Servants developed a warning system. When Carlos's lurching footsteps echoed through the corridors, chambermaids fled. Kitchen boys hid, even guards found urgent business elsewhere. The heir to the throne had become a monster everyone feared. And yet, the spark that would ignite this tragedy into an inferno was still to come. A betrayal so personal, so humiliating, that it would push Carlos beyond redemption. Enter Elizabeth of Valois, a radiant French princess who stepped into the Spanish court like a burst of sunlight. She was young, graceful, everything Carlos could never be, and she was supposed to be his. As part of a peace treaty between Spain and France, Elizabeth had been promised to Carlos, her portrait sent to him months in advance. For the first time in his tortured life, Carlos had something pure to hold on to. He pored over that portrait, memorizing every detail of the woman who would be his wife. It was a rare flicker of hope in a world that had given him nothing but pain. But Philip had other plans. Recently widowed, the king decided Spain needed a queen more than Carlos needed a bride. In a move that stunned Europe, Philip married Elizabeth himself, taking what had been promised to his son with the cold precision of a chess master claiming a queen. The wedding day was torture refined to an art. Carlos had to attend, dressed in specially crafted clothes to hide his deformities, and watch his father marry his intended bride. Elizabeth's vows to Philip were like daggers in his heart. Every word meant for him, stolen by his father. The cruelest twist was Elizabeth's kindness. She treated Carlos with warmth, calling him dear cousin, including him in court activities, perhaps out of pity, perhaps out of guilt. But her kindness was acid on an open wound. Every smile reminded him of what he'd lost, every gesture a mockery of what he'd never have. At state dinners, Carlos sat at the high table, forced to watch his father's hand rest possessively on Elizabeth's. Their quiet conversations in French, a language Carlos struggled with, cutting deeper than any blade. His obsession grew like a cancer. He'd station himself to watch her daily routines, following her through the gardens, his uneven gait making stealth impossible. The sound of his dragging foot on gravel became a court joke. You always knew when the prince was stalking the queen. His gifts to her were unsettling. Dead birds arranged outside her chambers, locks of his hair braided into intricate designs, even a defaced portrait where he'd scratched out his father's image and drawn himself in Philip's place. Elizabeth handled it with grace, never complaining publicly, but her ladies-in-waiting noticed her growing unease. She started locking her chambers at night, glancing over her shoulder when alone. The French princess, once so confident, now moved through the palace like prey. The breaking point came at a court masque. Emboldened by wine and the anonymity of his mask, Carlos approached Elizabeth during a dance. He whispered something in her ear, something that made her face go white. She excused herself immediately, and Philip's eyes followed his son with a look that could freeze blood. No one knows what he said, but from that moment, Elizabeth was never alone with him again. Guards were discreetly positioned to monitor their interactions, limited to public ceremonies where dozens of eyes watched every move. Carlos's humiliation turned into something darker than resentment. He began ranting to anyone who would listen that his father had stolen his life, his future, his purpose. His words grew violent, specific, speaking of revenge and justice. His mind, already a tinderbox, was primed for an explosion. All it needed was one small spark, and it came in 1562, on a stone staircase in the palace. Enraged, Carlos chased a servant girl who'd gasped at the sight of his twisted foot without his special shoes. Her involuntary shock triggered his fury, and he pursued her down the narrow service stairs. His malformed body betrayed him. His stronger leg overcompensated. His misshapen skull threw off his balance. Witnesses said he seemed to hang in the air for a moment before crashing down, his head striking the stone with a sound that echoed like a death knell. For 3 days, Carlos lay unconscious, his fractured skull leaking fluid, his breathing a rattling gasp. Philip summoned every physician in Spain, offering fortunes to save his heir. They tried everything, bleeding him until his sheets were crimson, applying poultices of ground beetles and mercury, praying in Latin, Greek, and Hebrew. Nothing worked. His fever climbed until his skin seemed ready to ignite. Then came Dr. Pinter with a radical solution. Trepanation, drilling into the skull to release the evil humors trapped inside. It was a procedure that killed more often than it cured, but Carlos was dying anyway. Philip gave his consent. The surgery happened at midnight, the physicians believing the moon's position would aid healing. They cleared the room except for the medical team and 2 strong men to hold Carlos still if he woke. The sound of the drill biting into bone carried through the palace walls, a grinding, scraping horror that servants said haunted their nightmares. And then, the unthinkable, Carlos woke. Halfway through, his eyes snapped open. He didn't scream. He just stared at the ceiling, fully conscious as they drilled into his head, his lips moving in what might have been prayer or curse. The strong men pinned his convulsing body as the surgeon continued, finally breaking through with a wet, sucking sound as blood and fluid escaped. For 2 weeks, Carlos lay with a hole in his head, drifting between consciousness and delirium. He raved about Elizabeth, his father, conspiracies real or imagined, even speaking to his dead mother in Portuguese he'd never learned. Miraculously, the fever broke. He recognized faces, spoke coherently, ate solid food. The court rejoiced. God had spared the heir. But something had changed. The Carlos who woke wasn't the same. The trauma had rearranged his already damaged brain. Where there had been cunning cruelty, now there was raw, unfiltered madness. He became obsessed with conspiracies, testing his food for poison, sleeping with weapons under his pillow, keeping lists of enemies with detailed plans for their punishment when he became king. Most chillingly, he began asking foreign ambassadors hypothetical questions. What would happen if a prince needed to remove an unfit king? How had other nations handled succession when a monarch lost God's favor? The boy who rose from that sickbed was no longer just a spurned lover or a cruel prince. He was a paranoid, raving creature openly plotting to kill his father. Philip sat in his dark study, a letter in his hand. It was a report from a spy, confirming his worst fear. His son was planning treason. Carlos had met with Don Juan of Austria, Philip's half-brother, proposing to flee to the Netherlands, where Spanish rule was already shaky. He'd present himself as a liberator, rallying Spain's enemies to spark a civil war. Philip's hands barely trembled as he set the letter down. Around him, maps lined the walls, showing an empire stretching across oceans, held together by his iron will. One mad prince could shatter it all. But this wasn't just about empire. It was about a father's love colliding with a king's duty. Philip had tried everything. Forgiving Carlos's violence, overlooking his threats, blaming his outbursts on illness. Even now, part of him wanted to burn the letter to pretend he'd never read it. But more reports followed. Carlos was hoarding weapons, bribing guards, sending encrypted letters to Spain's enemies, testing their support for a coup. Philip understood his son's rage. He knew he'd failed Carlos as a father. The boy's deformities, his madness, his cruelty, they all stemmed from the Habsburg obsession with pure blood, a legacy Philip had continued. Every twisted bone in Carlos's body was a monument to that pride. He began his countermeasures with heartbreaking subtlety, assigning loyal servants to report Carlos's every word, quietly removing his weapons, even inviting him for long walks to talk of legacy and duty. But Carlos's paranoia only grew. He accused his father of poisoning him, stealing his birthright, being a tyrant who'd lost heaven's mandate. During one dinner, he stood before the court and declared Philip unfit to rule, demanding young blood for Spain. The silence that followed was deafening. The international situation made delay impossible. Foreign courts were watching, waiting. If Carlos fled, the French would use him against Spain, the Protestants in the Netherlands would rally to him, and the fragile European order would collapse. Philip wrote to every major court, not with threats but with careful explanations of a father's burden, a king's duty. He was preparing the ground. The final straw came in January 1568. Carlos revealed to his trusted servants his plan to flee to Italy, then the Netherlands, believing he could return at the head of an army. One of those servants was Philip's spy. That night, Philip made his choice. He called for his battle armor, not for war, but to confront his own blood. As he fastened each piece of steel, the father died, leaving only the King of Spain, defender of an empire that could not fall to madness. On January 18, 1568, Philip marched to Carlos's bedchamber, the arrest swift and clinical. Carlos didn't resist. Perhaps he couldn't, or perhaps he saw the futility. Witnesses said he looked at his father one last time, some claiming he smiled, others that he wept. He was moved to a tower room, furnished like a prince's but barred like a prison. For 6 months he rotted. Without exercise, his weak body atrophied, his shorter leg withered, bedsores festered where his twisted spine pressed against the mattress. The mental decay was worse. Isolation fed his paranoia until reality unraveled. He held conversations with invisible figures, his dead mother, past kings, even versions of himself. Raging, pleading, conducting council meetings with empty air. The stench was unbearable. He refused to bathe, convinced the water was poisoned, and let sores on his scalp weep freely. Philip received daily reports on his son's condition, the sores, the raving, the transformation into something barely human, and did nothing. No physicians, no treatments. Carlos was left to rot, just as he claimed. In his lucid moments, he wrote frantic letters to his father, alternating between begging for forgiveness and spewing threats. Philip kept every letter but never responded. By July, Carlos could barely walk, his skin hanging loose on his malformed bones. He developed an obsession with ice, demanding buckets of it in the sweltering Spanish summer, drinking it, pouring it over his head to cool the fire in his brain. On July 24, 1568, a servant found him unconscious in a pool of ice water, his lips blue, his breathing faint. They carried him to his bed. He weighed so little one man could lift him. For hours, he drifted between life and death, mumbling in languages he'd never spoken, calling for the dead. Then, with sudden clarity, he opened his eyes and said, "Tell my father I forgive him." Was it genuine, or the cruelest revenge, forcing Philip to live with that mercy? Hours later, Don Carlos died at 23. The official story was natural illness, with no mention of imprisonment or decay. But Philip's true violence came after death. Within hours, servants removed every portrait of Carlos, burned his belongings, destroyed letters mentioning him. Scribes edited court records to erase his existence. His funeral was quiet, his tomb bearing only his name and dates. Servants who'd attended him were reassigned or silenced. The tower room was sealed. Philip had committed the perfect murder, not of a body but of a story. For 2 centuries, Carlos vanished from history until Spain's enemies revived him. Friedrich Schiller's play Don Carlos turned him into a romantic hero crushed by tyranny, and Giuseppe Verdi's opera made him a tragic lover, noble and doomed. The real Carlos, the cruel, broken prince, was forgotten, replaced by a fictional martyr. Philip won every battle, preserving his empire and silencing his son. But stories can't be killed. Even now, in opera houses worldwide, audiences weep for a prince who never existed, while the real Don Carlos, eaten alive by his poisoned blood, remains a shadow. Thank you for joining us on this grim journey. If this tale chilled you, hit subscribe, share it, and drop a comment. What do you think of Carlos's tragic story? Was he a monster, a victim, or both? Let's keep unearthing the past's darkest secrets together.